Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today. I'm Mary Beth Gallagher, the Director of Engagement at Domini. Welcome to our webinar, Designing the Next 50 Years of Transportation. We really appreciate you joining, and a special thank you to all of our panelists, Porie Saikia, Alex Pazuchanix, Thomas Maltese. We're going to have a great conversation today. I'll just note on this screen that this is a webinar intended for educational and informational purposes only, not intended for investment advice. So our program today, we're going to hear some remarks from each of our panelists and then open up a conversation for discussion. The webinar is being recorded, and we will have the opportunity for all of the attendees to submit questions in the Q&A box. So please feel free to use that throughout. So thank you. I'll start by introducing Domini. Domini Impact Investments is an SEC registered investment advisory firm focused on two twin goals: universal human dignity and ecological sustainability. Our investment process and our approach centers these twin goals as we evaluate companies for their eligibility for investment, focus on a company's business model, as well as its relationship with stakeholders. We use another pillar of impact through engagement to try to influence company policies and practices to address some of society's greatest challenges. We recognize that climate change is one of the most critical issues of our time, and transportation is one of the greatest sources of greenhouse gas emissions. We also really believe that by understanding and lifting up solutions, hearing from innovative leaders, and creating conversations of connection, we can help advance some of the solutions that we need to advance change. Turning to the topic of today's conversation, we recognize that transportation is the fastest growing source of greenhouse gas emissions and accounts for 27% of global emissions. Traffic is the #1 source of air pollution globally, and 9 out of 10 people live with unhealthy levels of air pollution, according to the World Health Organization. By 2050, almost 70% of the people in the world will live in urban areas. Today, we're excited to be joined by all of you in attendance and 3 experts who are addressing transportation, mobility, the use of data, and sustainability from 3 critical but intersecting vantage points: from the role of government, from the role of data, and the role of working together with cities on electrification. They are leading the way with innovations, and we're hoping that the conversation today will inform the audience and spark new ideas and help people feel energized and optimistic about the future ahead. We'll welcome the audience again to submit questions via the Q&A. Please feel free to do that throughout, and we'll address them towards the end of the conversation. So now I'll introduce our 3 panelists, starting with Porie. Porie Saikia is the Senior Director of Environment, Energy, Sustainability, and Industrial Hygiene at the New York City Metropolitan Transportation Authority. She has had a long career in the design and construction industry, making significant contributions to her climate leadership, transportation initiatives, and project development. Porie has worked with various departments in the New York City government, as was appointed to the New York State Transportation Advisory Panel for the Climate Action Council of the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act of 2020. Thank you so much, Porie, for being here. Alex Pazuchanix is the Director of Strategy and Mobility Policy at Vianova, a Paris-based startup, where he helps cities meet their mobility challenges through the use of data and policy. He was previously the Mobility Solutions Manager for the City of Seattle, where he managed sustainable, shared, electric, and autonomous mobility programs. He is also the former Assistant Director for Policy, Planning, and Permitting at the City of Pittsburgh's Department of Mobility and Infrastructure. Thomas Maltese is Senior Manager for C40's Zero Emissions Bus Rapid Deployment Accelerator Project. Working across different teams in C40 and partner organizations, he supports C40 cities as they plan, finance, and deploy electric buses. Prior to joining C40, he kickstarted his career in the field of climate action at the Climate Group as EV100 project coordinator, managing relationships with companies committed to accelerating the transition to electric mobility from within their own operations. Thank you to each of you for being here, and more importantly, for the work each of you are doing every day to advance sustainable transportation. We'll get started with this conversation by turning to Porie. So thank you, Porie. Can you give us a bit of an introduction to the MTA, its scope, how many riders does it move, and how does it do it? I'll turn to you, Porie.
Thank you. MTA, which is, thank you. MTA, which is Metropolitan Transportation Authority of New York. It is not just New York City, it's New York and a tri-state area. It's an authority that reports to the governor's office, and it basically, as the slide shows, it covers about 75% of the New York metro population, moving of the New York metro population. And it does have, as you can see, it's New York State, which is in blue, and then there is New Jersey, and there's portions of Connecticut. And I will explain, and it's sort of responsible for 1.4 trillion metro area GDP. There are about 7 million workers that are within the MTA service area. So what, how does it, what's the total number of riders that we have? We move about between 8.5 to 9 million riders every weekday. And MTA's sort of network covers about 5,000 square miles of operating territory. And then it's kind of goes to the east from New York, New York City, which is Manhattan, where the starting point is. When I say east, it's about 120 miles out into Long Island to Montauk. Goes 90 miles north, which is New York State, also includes Connecticut, and about 70 miles west to New Jersey. We have about 2,000 miles of track, about 6,000 buses, but 6,000 plus buses, we are very actively getting involved in electrification now. And we also maintain and manage tunnels and bridges that come into New York. And MTA has 4 major operating agencies, actually 5, but the railroads are together under one president. So it's Long Island Railroad and Metro North Railroad. The subways, which is the New York City underground, above ground subways. We have the buses is a different division, and the bridges and tunnels. We collect tolls, of course, therefore we maintain the bridges and tunnels. So these are the operating agencies that make up the MTA's, how MTA moves people. I think your next question was about, am I moving into the,
no,
too quickly?
Perfect. It's a perfect transition. What we really love to hear also, given that huge scope, where sustainability fits within the MTA's agenda and how you're addressing climate change.
Well, public transit, MTA is public transit. Public transit is the backbone of urban sustainability. And this slide is to say, this is not what we're doing. This happens by MTA just being, because MTA replaces about 700,000 by people taking the MTA, public transit, subways, buses, railroads, etc. It's New York City actually has 700,000 cars not coming into the CBD on a weekday, which then obviously a formula that we have used to results in giving us about 17 million metric tons per year savings of greenhouse gas. Now, obviously we are MTA, we run trains, we run buses, we run equipment, all of that. And we do use fuel, and we do have emissions, but that comes up to about 2.1 million metric ton. So when you look at the savings by being a public transit, it is annually, without just being a public transit in an urban area like New York City, we stop from putting in, or New York City stops from putting into the atmosphere about 7 million metric tons of greenhouse gas. And MTA sustainability focus started in about 2008. And one of the things that kind of stepped up after that was post-Sandy was the climate adaptation focus. And along with that, obviously, we were part of the sort of commitment to the Paris Agreement. We have looked at all of that, and therefore reduction of greenhouse gas, reduction of emission, reduction of energy usage has become a very, very big focus for us. So these are kind of leadership commitments. These are not mandates. What you see here is one of the things we do. Obviously, if you can't measure something, you can't, do any better with it. So we started to measure from 2008 onwards our emissions. For that, we joined the Climate Registry, and we are one of the founding members of the Climate Registry in the United States. And every year we submit, which is independently verified. In 2019, end of 2019, we were also committed to join the science-based target of the Paris Agreement with the United Nations, and our goals were approved. They go through a 1 year of verification process, and finally we were approved on our strategies and goals as to how we were going to get there. And in 2021. And the other things that we voluntarily participate within New York State, within the tri-state New York area, is the demand reduction programs. It's a voluntary program that's run by the power distributors here and power generators here. We are on the list, and certain areas we have facilities all over New York, all over upstate, all over Connecticut, New Jersey, parts in New Jersey. So when there is a demand requirement of energy in those areas, we are actually called in and said, well, can you lower your energy usage for this date, or today or tomorrow or whatever, and we do that. So that's kind of something voluntary we do. And it's not just MTA, anybody can do that. Any building in New York area, any facility in New York area can join this program. And we also partner with New York Power Authority for the Energy Service Program. New York Power Authority is who we get our power from. It generates power for New York, and it's a governmental authority. And there are certain numbers you see here. That's basically what we have so far accomplished by partnering in reducing in savings of using of natural gas and fuel oil, and avoided about 78,000 metric tons of carbon footprint. So that's kind of where we are. And then when it comes to laws, as you mentioned, CLCPA is something that we had been a part of. I personally had been a part of in developing. So now it's a mandate. As of early this year, as of late last year, actually December, it is a mandate, and we are allocated out of the 11 trillion BTU reduction by 2025. MTA is going to be held responsible for 848 billion BTU reduction from our base year of 2015. Not from before, but from base year. And I'm actually very happy to say that in the last 2 years, before it actually came into enforcement, we had already been started doing this. And out of what our allocated reduction is, we've already achieved 70% of it, which is something because of our voluntary commitments that we had started. There was a question that you had asked at one time about equity and about economics, and this is something that I wanted to talk about. I call it MTA being a regenerative organization because it actually because of what it does, it actually develops new jobs for people. And all of these are based on our new construction work, our new operational requirements, etc. That employment in these areas that you see, both in upstate New York, in the Mid-Hudson region, and this is mostly in New York State, of course, is that because we have a requirement, that contractual requirement, it's a procurement strategy that we have put in place, is where we do require anyone who bids on any of our projects to number one, to have all of their manufacturing work done in New York State. And now, obviously, if things can't get done, they get a waiver, but they have to justify why they need a waiver. And that generates all these jobs. That has generated, for example, our rail cars. We buy rail cars from companies like Bombardier. And because of this requirement, they have actually moved in to New York State and have built facilities. So, and as a result, they have hired people. And now some of these companies have gone on to continue to do their manufacturing, and they have clients all over the world. And so they do manufacture things with New York State labor, and they're selling around the world. So that means the jobs that were developed because of the MTA have almost become permanent. And so this is kind of the dollar and the number of jobs, just as this was just in a 1 year for one of our 5-year programs. So now our 5-year programs even gone on with more work and more projects and more money invested. So these numbers have actually gone up.
Thank you, Porie. Thank you so much for sharing about the scope, the scale, the sustainability initiatives, your role within the New York Climate Act, and the important role on supporting the local economy. I'm really grateful for those conversations, those contributions, and that work. We'll turn now to Alex, who will share a little bit about his work and the role of data and mobility. So Alex, just to get started, can you introduce your organization, Via Nova, and set the scene for us? What is your company's role in supporting or facilitating sustainable mobility?
Yeah, thank you for the chance to participate. As was mentioned, I'm working at a small startup, about 25 people, called Via Nova. We're based primarily in Paris, with some folks around Europe. I'm actually sitting in the Amsterdam train station at the moment because we do work with cities and regions around Europe. Primarily on this question of how do you make smarter, more sustainable, safer transportation networks through the use of data, and more importantly, kind of how do you demystify what may sometimes be an overwhelming amount of data into something that's manageable and insightful. We started kind of in the shared mobility space in particular, which is quite robust in Europe. Bike share, car share, scooter share, moped share, cargo bike share. There's actually a town in Finland with ski share. So it's the idea of kind of shared mobility, both because of the land use patterns and the economic characteristics of Europe tends to be quite robust. But shared mobility is an interesting domain because you're dealing with, number one, largely connected vehicles that have kind of cell phone connections, so it's relatively easy to trace their movements, their locations. Two, that have kind of a fixed number of companies that are responsible, right? In most cities, there's 2 or 3 operators of a service, so it's kind of easy to deal with them directly as opposed to trying to collect data directly from consumers. And 3, it's political, right? It's in the public conversation. You see shared devices on the streets. There's actually a plebiscite, a public vote in Paris later this spring around whether to continue to allow shared mopeds, for example. So it's a controversial topic, right? This tension between public order and public space management and the environmental benefits or the connectivity benefits. And so part of our role is to kind of serve as that translator between people generating data and providing transportation services on the one hand, and the governments, the regional agencies that are responsible for regulating and managing public space on the other.
Thanks, Alex, for setting that scene. And exciting to hear the ways that shared mobility and ride sharing is happening. You talk about this mobility data revolution, and it would be interesting to hear a little bit more about what that means, what data we have, what we need more of, and how you think this can be valuable to cities and companies.
I think there's often a challenge that public sector agencies have, which is maybe twofold. The first is, in most cases, quite a bit of data exists, either already generated by the public sector or generated by the private sector. But there's an information gap in kind of distilling that into something actionable or manageable on the operator side. I mean, Porie mentioned this earlier. You manage what you measure, right? And if you don't have the apparatus in place for collecting that information, but more importantly for finding the needle in the haystack, finding the trend, finding the the abnormality, it's much harder to take action on it. And two, the practical reality is organizations, particularly government organizations, are complex. Decision makers and data scientists are not often the same person, rarely the same person, and there's often some layers between them. And so part of what we try to do is simplify that data into something that's manageable for a program manager, say, right, or a policymaker or an elected official, where the element that is important is to be quick, efficient, and raise that hotspot, raise that primary point. Shared mobility is interesting because it was this kind of starting point for us. As the head of engineering likes to say, we count dots when they move around on a map. And so a lot of our work recently has been kind of applying this technique, not just to shared devices, but all sorts of mobility, whether it's logistics vehicles or public transport or car data, floating car data from OEMs, car manufacturers. The principle holds, and it's important to kind of build that muscle memory, let's say, of being able to make a data-informed decision, monitor that progress, create a feedback loop, and iterate on policymaking to respond to it.
Thanks for sharing that. Yeah, we know that your work is primarily with cities in Europe, and we're interested to learn a little bit more about this engagement and what cities are learning from your product and what you're learning from cities.
Yeah. As an American planner, you sort of dream a bit of getting to work with many of the cities that I've been kind of fortunate to work with, places like Stockholm and Helsinki that are quite far advanced in terms of the kind of smart city approach, right, and the ability to use technology to create more livable cities. As I mentioned, I'm sitting in Amsterdam today, the granddaddy of them all, right, when it comes to sustainable mobility, cycling infrastructure in the Netherlands, of course. But the thing that's maybe interesting and intriguing to me, to us, has been the different ways that cities have the same goals, but attempt to meet them in very different ways, right? Many of the cities that we work with, many in Europe, are subscribed to, have made commitments to zero emission zones, to low emission zones, to electrification of their infrastructure. But the techniques vary considerably, right? Some take a more, let's say, electrification-oriented approach. Some take a more active mobility approach. So the techniques are different. And I think it's important, especially for American audiences, to appreciate that there are many cities where the form factor, the land use, frankly, the car ownership and car usage rates are not so dissimilar than they are in the U.S. I think people look at Amsterdam or Paris and say like, oh, that's never going to happen here, right? That they have a head start, they have yada yada yada. But the reality is, we work with Tallinn, for example, in Estonia, or Budapest. Like these are cities where, frankly, there was a strong amount of automobile dependency for the last 50 or 60 years, same as in the U.S. And so I think there is still a lot for American cities to learn from these European counterparts that are actually closer to peers than they are to aspirants, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I see a question in the Q&A we can turn to later, sort of comparing lessons learned from Europe and how they might apply in the US. So we can turn to that towards the end of the conversation. And again, welcome all the attendees to submit questions if they have them. Alex, just one more piece of the conversation that I wanted to ask you about at the outset is this question of transportation equity. And we recognize that Vianova emphasizes safety. So can you talk a little bit about how you work with customers to identify and solve safety challenges, especially those for pedestrians, bikes, and scooters?
Yeah, transportation safety is a fascinating topic right now. Obviously of critical concern in the U.S., but frankly, a major priority in many European cities as well. Despite, frankly, significantly lower rates of killed and seriously injured individuals compared to their U.S. peers. But our approach to shared mobility, or our approach to safety rather, thinks about the idea of, let's say, risk pattern and risk identification from a multimodal perspective. So typically, most Vision Zero efforts, transportation safety efforts, are a little bit of fighting the last war, right? The data point historically is the location of previous crashes or collisions. And those represent kind of the primary places where investment and intervention goes. Our perspective is to try to incorporate new data sources to give an idea of where propensity for risk might be, right? So whether that's data from car companies relating to speeding or heavy braking, whether that's data around vulnerable road users like bike share and scooter share users, right? Sort of two-wheeled travelers. The idea is not necessarily, we know that the traffic engineers that we work with at the local level know their interventions perhaps better than we do, but to give visibility and to understand relative risk from a multimodal perspective, we think kind of creates some unique opportunities for, let's say, preventative countermeasures rather than only after the fact.
Thanks. Really important in thinking about the new ways that data can help us sort of get out ahead of risky patterns and practices. So thanks for sharing that. At this stage, I think we'll turn to you, Thomas, and bring you and your perspective at C40 into the conversation. Thank you so much for joining us. I wonder if you could start by sort of telling us a little bit about C40, the organization, its areas of focus, and whether it's had successes with working with cities on climate action to date.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me to join this conversation. My name is Thomas Maltese and I work at C40 Cities, which is a global network of almost 100 mayors of the world's leading cities, including, of course, New York City, well represented here today. And these cities, these mayors are working together to deliver the urgent and inclusive action that is required to confront the climate crisis that we're currently living today. There is something that has become more and more evident over the last few decades, and that is the role that cities can play in delivering climate action. Whereas national governments might be slower, cities can deliver action at a much faster pace, leveraging the role of their mayors, of their staff in city halls, and ultimately their citizens. And cities are already working to do so. And C40 has been around for over 15 years now. And in the last few years, our focus has been to support the cities in developing their climate action plans that can support the city in delivering resilient and inclusive climate action that is aligned with the 1.5-degree target of the Paris Agreement. And the majority of cities has already finalized the creation of this climate action plan, identifying areas of priority. And as we're here today to talk about transportation is, of course, one of the major sources of greenhouse gas emissions, in addition to a lot of pollutants. So that is why I believe I've been invited here today, because I'm part of the transportation team at C40, focusing, as you can see, well, obviously the bus was kind of a hint, but we've been working for over a decade, kickstarting the zero-emission transportation revolution in Latin American cities, as Of course, transportation is the biggest source of emission. Latin America representing one of the most urbanized regions in the world, and where citizens are most dependent on urban buses to move around within their cities. And that's where the Zebra partnership comes into the picture. Mary-Beth, you already mentioned what it stands for. The Zero Emission Bus Rapid Deployment Accelerator is the partnership that I'm very fortunate and lucky enough to be here to tell you about. It's the first time I speak to a North American audience, and I appreciate that maybe talking about public transportation is maybe a bit less common. But from where I'm sitting here today, from Brazil, public transportation is, as we see it, the spine of cities. And if you want to improve a city, both from a climate perspective, but also from a social perspective, you need to tackle public transportation. And as we, measure our actions from a climate lens, transportation is extraordinarily important. But then you add to that the health benefits, the amount of air pollutants that you can remove, or you can avoid by decarbonizing public transport fleets. Then you've essentially got a phenomenal win-win situation that we are here to accelerate.
Thanks so much, Thomas. And that those twin goals of holding equity and health benefits along with climate action is really so important. So thank you for the leadership that you're having there. I wonder if you can share any examples of how you're working with certain cities that you've been coordinating with on the electric bus rollout. Are there any stories you want to share?
Absolutely. So our starting point is that only a few years ago, the market for zero-emission buses was virtually non-existent in Latin America. But we knew, based on the years of work with the city, that there was a demand for these vehicles. So our theory of change was that by sending a strong message to the market that there is demand. So 5 years ago, a wide selection of cities signed the Green and Healthy Streets Accelerator, pledging to only procure zero-emission buses from 2025 onwards. Many of these cities are located in Latin America. Now, on that basis, we were then able to convene manufacturers so that they could hear this message and start thinking of Latin America as a priority region to start deploying zero-emission bus technology, which, as again, until then wasn't really an option for cities. So from the Zebra perspective, what we try to do is creating the sign of demand, creating offer from the market, and bringing together investors to come together and discuss, identify, and implement some of those business models that can help cities transition their bus fleets to zero emission at a much faster pace than they would otherwise. And this has proven extremely successful, working with Bogota and Santiago, cities that have really taken the lead on a global scale to transition their fleets, and demonstrating that if you can think of bus ownership in an innovative way, by really shuffling how things are done and questioning the status quo, you can achieve immense success that can eventually lead to public policy change. And just to give you an example, Bogota recently passed a Climate Emergency Act that essentially forbids any new fossil fuel buses to enter the city's fleet. And this was based on the fact that the city had already demonstrated that it was able to procure 1,500 electric buses, now currently the largest fleet of e-buses outside of China. And why is this important? I love to tell the story of a panel discussion I heard at COP26, which was from a representative of the Ministry of Transportation in Denmark, speaking to another panelist from a city in Chile, and saying how he was inspired to push forward for the electrification of the bus fleet in Denmark based on the inspiration that it had received observing what Chile had done. And this is why I think the work done in Latin America is so exciting right now, because it demonstrates how regions, cities where there is low levels of subsidies and much greater barriers than there are, for example, in regions such as North America or Europe, that cities can take leadership, can demonstrate that this is a feasible model, and that ultimately the health benefits are not only for the users of the buses, but for the entire city. So it really is, as we see it, probably the first segment where we can reach a tipping point that can then ripple into so many other segments, starting, for example, from freight and eventually other segments.
Thanks, Thomas, and for sharing that example. You mentioned a little bit the new business models. Is there anything you want to elaborate on, sort of what that requires or how to make that happen, how to unlock that in terms of ownership?
Yes. I'll try and do that in a simple way, because it can be visually complicated to present this. But what we've seen so far is that the traditional way in which buses are owned and operated in Latin America isn't really adequate for large-scale electric bus deployment, because buses are usually owned by small transport operating companies. And these companies don't necessarily have access to credit to then foot the bill for electric buses, which have a capital cost that is usually 2 to 4 times the price of an equivalent diesel bus. So what we've seen in cities like Santiago and Bogota is the separation of the asset ownership. All of a sudden, you create a new scheme in which the buses are owned by a third party that can provide the vehicles to the city or to the operators. And these third party actors, let's call them investors. Usually they're electric utility companies, investment funds, asset managers. These are entities that have equity, they have access to debt, and they are in some cases risk takers that understand the business model behind electric buses. And what is the business model? The business model is that the total cost of ownership of an electric bus is lower than a fossil fuel equivalent, in spite of the higher upfront cost. And that is thanks to lower maintenance costs, lower operating costs. So as long as you have the capital to buy the asset in the first place, you can then reap financial advantages over the life of the vehicle, which, by the way, when we take the average lifetime of a diesel bus, which is 10 years, electric buses have a considerable advantage, because we expect them to run for 15 years. So there are so many benefits to be taken advantage of, whether you look at it from a climate perspective, from a health benefits perspective, from a financial perspective. But it does require some innovative thinking as to how cities can do that, translate that into public tenders, translate that into policy.
That's perfect. Thanks for spelling that out, because I think what this challenge before us really requires is thinking about new ways of financing, doing business, partnering, and bringing together new solutions. So with that, I think we can bring all the panelists back together, and to open up the discussion a little bit, I wanted to see if anyone has reactions or wants to respond to anything each of you have heard and shared, and then I can turn to some specific questions I have for each of you.
Well, I'm particularly intrigued by Villanova's work, because what we see as a challenge is the informality of public transportation in many places in the global south. And with the urgency that we have to halve our emissions to stay within 1.5 degrees, we personally don't think that we have the time to wait until transportation is formalized, and only then you can decarbonize the fleets. So I think there is an argument to be made, and like some brainstorming needed to see how can new ways of thinking mobility, so mobility as a service, and working with private individuals that own a vehicle and operate the transport service in the city, I don't have the answer. But I think you can only access some of these solutions with the data that, you know, companies like Genova are trying to provide.
Well, and I think the interesting element here, the opportunity is to think about how that data still serves the public purpose, right? It's you know, it's an opportunity to think about more targeted subsidies or more targeted interventions, even within a private sector market. The practical reality is, like, we know that transportation is not a you know, high margin business. We know that the economics of transportation, particularly public transportation, you know, the whole point is that it's a public good. And so it's, you know, if, well, in some European contexts, it's profitable, but that has a lot to do with sort of the individual dynamic. In most places, right, public transport is not expected to make money, nor should it be expected to make money. But that doesn't mean that when private operators are providing public services or providing public benefit, that there's an opportunity to use data to make more targeted, smarter investments, and to incentivize the kind of activity, the kind of coverage, the kind of connections that otherwise might not be happening organically.
Thanks for that. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about sort of, a lot of us are individuals that interact with public transportation on a daily basis. Thinking about sort of the next 50 years, what does this mean for us as individuals who want to support the low carbon transition and support public transportation? Any reactions from each of you around sort of what is an individual's role?
Let me take that one first, since I am public transit. There was a question I noticed. There was something about light rail systems. There was somebody asked about light rail system. So, I mean, I think the question was the light rail is cheaper or is it better? I forget what it said. Anyway, I think it says are we better focusing on buses? Right.
Yeah, place for light rail in the US should be focused on buses.
there are a lot of cities, about maybe 25, 30 cities in the US actually have light rail system. Boston, being one of the closest to New York, has a good light rail system. Obviously, New Jersey has some. So I think I was just responding to that question about that. And between light rail system and buses is light rail is more expensive to operate when it comes to, you know, private operators, etc., because it has to be fully loaded to make the most benefit out of it. So depending on, you know, how many, what is the volume of riders, light rail makes it kind of it's affected by that. So that was the first question. Then I think the other thing question you were asking is that we, being a public transit system, and as Alex said, it is for public good. And therefore, you're not supposed to make, you know, you're not looking to make money. But of course, and we are always looking, as a public transit system, we're always looking for funding. I mean, the reason for that is we need state of good repairs, one thing, advanced technology is another thing, you know, and we have about 6,500 buses in our bus fleet. And we are committed to totally electrifying our bus fleet by 2040. Which is not a lot of time left, and so we've started buying, and obviously you can't let go of what we have. We already have about 6,500 buses running on CNG and running on, you know, not all of them fully diesel, but so we have a plan as to how we are going to go through it. However, the goal is by 2040, and the other issue that comes with it is infrastructure. So it's not just the cost of the bus or the cost of, you know, operating an electric bus. It's the major infrastructure upgrade that's required. And then obviously after that comes is there enough power? Like, are we going to have enough power? So we are, as an entity here, looking at alternative sources of energy. We're looking at renewables. We're looking at solar. We're looking at hydrogen as a backup for buses. So there's a lot of my office, my department, actually, we are doing a lot of piloting, a lot of sort of experimentation, working with researchers from different countries, different universities, and trying to focus in and, being an organization like the MTA that has such a large number of vehicles, we can't just, make a policy decision just by reviewing or by experimenting 1, 2, or 3 things. It really, and it's public money, so it really has to go through an extensive process of validation. So I'm not sure if I answered your question, but that's kind of what I was thinking when Alex was talking.
If I can add one element to this that I think is quite important, the question was kind of what should we as individuals be doing, and I think sometimes it's quite important to remember that people are making choices, right? Every individual choice is important, but especially as purveyors of public resources, or as public transport operators, or as governments funding public transport, we have to make that choice an easy one, right? The question around light rail, I would argue that in many cases, the reason that light rail is kind of seen as desirable in comparison is the grade separation, right? The fact that on-time performance is, or the line is fixed, kind of the station amenities. This is some work that I'm sure Thomas can talk a bit about in the Global South as well, in terms of kind of leading from a BRT perspective. But that reliability and that quality of choice is actually something that's really important. And I think we need to not just make sure that public transport is a mode of necessity for those that have to take public transport, but actually that it is a mode of choice for people who otherwise would be making that trip by driving.
Yeah, there's a saying that says a progressive country is not where a progressive country is not where everybody has a car to drive, but where everybody takes public transit. And I see another question that's especially directed to me, I think, and it's about how is MTA negotiating with Uber and Lyft. We are not. We don't do those kind of negotiation. However, we have an extensive first mile, last mile connectivity studies that we do. We have our planning group here, and one of the things, as having been a part of, and it's not specific to MTA, I just want to say this up front, but having been a part of the CLCP advisory board, one of the things that we have been looking at and we have been talking about at the state level is incentivizing these kind of first mile, last mile connective, service offers, whether it's Uber, whether it's Lyft, whether it's private taxi service, whatever, that the state would look at incentivizing them for connecting the transit riders, because obviously we don't have stations in every town. So that was my answer to a question that was written down or asked.
Thank you, Porie. And Thomas, to you.
Well, just going back to what we were discussing a moment ago, I'd like to maybe shift our attention a little bit away from public transport, because, well, maybe not so quickly. So what we're advocating for is obviously the extreme importance to invest more in public transport, as Alex says, as a public good. So that for us is fundamental for the health of the city and the citizens. But going beyond that, well, I'd like to quote my CEO here, Mark Watts, who says that the single most impactful action that a city can take on climate action is to prioritize the needs of pedestrians and cyclists over cars. And that can touch upon public transport, but is actually referring more to walking and cycling infrastructure. And when you ask us what will cities look like in 50 years' time, I think it's worth taking a moment to celebrate the evolution of walking and cycling infrastructure in cities. New York has done a phenomenal job. Paris, London, Amsterdam probably didn't have to do so much work, but like these cities have done extraordinary progress that was also accelerated by the pandemic. So that, there are some positive elements that we can identify in the last few years. And we see this changing very rapidly. Cities where no one took the bike now are becoming bike cities. I think of Mexico City, Bogota. So genuinely, like the single decisions of mayors, transport secretariats that decide how to allocate the space of the city can dramatically change the life of citizens. And you know, then you see there's a lot of conversation now about the 15-minute cities. You know, how can cities be shaped around a structure that allows everyone to be within 15 minutes of all essential services without having to take their car, driving, like walking, cycling, or taking a bus. That might not be the case for the US just because of the size. Maybe we might be talking about 30-minute cities, but still, it's just a cultural shift that I see happening within the cities, and it's having a really strong ripple effect all across the world.
You know, in New York City, Thomas, people want to have a 3-block radius of having. They want to walk only 3 blocks, and in Manhattan, actually, it is. You can get there. Just to mention something else that you talked about is New York City under Mayor Bloomberg, who was a very active participant at C40, has gone through a tremendous change about, you know, walking, biking, and taking over parts of city streets and turning them into just pedestrian areas. And New York City statistically actually is people who, because most people take public transit in New York City, otherwise you wouldn't get to another, you know, from one end, wherever you're going, it takes a lot longer, public transit. So most people do that. And as a result, New York City residents are considered, they walk 2 times more than the federal requirement. So they walk, and don't, you know, I have a number which sounds really weird, but 351 minutes per week, which is twice as much of an average American, which then results into health, you know, issues. It's good, you know, if you walk that much, go up and down the stairs. Obviously now we are turning all our stations, we are working on turning all our station into accessible with, you know, for wheelchair accessibility. But
thank you.
that's the health benefit.
That health benefit, that's definitely a theme we've each raised throughout. I think it's really important to celebrate and recognize that. There's a question in the Q&A. If anyone would be interested in sharing about work they're doing to embrace micro-mobility and enabling the last mile connectivity to mass transit. I guess whoever takes this first, if you can start by defining micro-mobility. And Alex, it looks like you're ready.
Yeah, I can start there. So micro-mobility is essentially the idea of using small, typically shared mobility, right? Kick scooters, bicycles, but with an intended purpose of a longer journey, right? So something that might not make sense for, you know, 5 or 15 kilometers trip. Sorry, I'm in metric these days. You know, you are kind of splitting the difference between the connection to public transport, making sure that the core services can kind of run more reliably. This is especially actually important in a North American context, especially outside of New York City, where the density of the population density is quite low. It's expensive, time-consuming, arduous for buses to kind of get to everywhere. If you're instead able to actually bring people to buses using micromobility, or in some cases, you know, using shared van pool or things like that in order to kind of concentrate the demand. I think it creates a kind of efficiency. Some of the early experiments in both the US and in Europe have been around, let's say, subsidizing the trip or pricing the trip comparable to taking a bus the whole way, so that you're not kind of being effectively double taxed on taking 2 distinct trips. This is, I think, arguably one of the key benefits potentially of a mass tool, right? A mobility as a service tool where you can have that integrated fare payment. But I think that the challenge is really making sure that you combine those micromobility options with accessible mobility options as well. so that you are kind of not disqualifying or not reducing access to people, but instead kind of offering a range depending on their capabilities.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
this integrated fare system is actually, there's a lot of work going on, especially in Europe and a lot of cities in Europe there. And so are we here between our trains, buses, and the subways, yeah.
Thank you. As we turn towards the last few minutes, one final invitation for anyone to submit questions. We have one remark about the importance of pedestrian-friendly cities, so I'm definitely interested in supporting that agenda. As we turn to close, I want to offer you each just a minute or two for some final reflections, and if you have any remarks on the role of collaboration between the public sector, private sector, the individual, and how to really support and accelerate the transition to sustainable transportation. I'll start with you, Porie, and then we'll turn to you, Alex and Thomas, for just a wrap up.
Well, again, public transit is to me, that is, you need to strengthen public transit system in every urban, and I'm not talking about cities that everything is few and far in between. I'm talking about dense urban cities, and as we are going forward into the next 100 years, next 50 years, there is going to be so many more of these dense cities all over. I mean, there's so it's statistically, I come from the construction world, and statistically we say that every week we are building a whole new New York City somewhere else in the world, and so it's sort of it is inevitable that transportation, and as both my co-speakers here have said, public transport is the backbone of a livable, desirable, sustainable urban city. So urban region, so urban sustainability is totally depends on its transportation system. And one of the things that I really, mode shift, and Alex mentioned it, it's wanting to take the public transit. And even in New York today, during COVID or after COVID, you talk to people, they would rather actually drive their car. And COVID was great because there wasn't that much traffic. So people don't drive because of the congestion.
Mm-hmm.
But we want to get to a place where you say, I am so much more comfortable taking public transit rather than drive, because it's so tedious to be driving, to be focusing on something that I'd rather be reading a book or rather be doing something else. I would really like to get to that point. I mean, I do that myself. I come to work 5 days of work every day. Every morning I take 3 modes of transportation coming to work, and I take 3 modes of transportation going back. And I don't have a problem with that, because it's kind of, to me, it's an advantage. So that's where I think, and like I said, public transit has to get to a point where people want to take it.
That's important. Thank you, Porie. Alex, to you for a closing remark.
Yeah, I mean, I think the important thing to remember the next 50 years, the next 100 years, if we do it well, it will actually in many ways look like 50 or 100 years ago in terms of the way that people travel. In most cities, including American cities for that matter, have that core skeleton still of walkable neighborhoods that we retrofitted for car dominance, and there's no reason that we kind of can't return to that sort of more walkable, more livable, more bikeable way. I think data is an important part of that story, but it doesn't necessarily, data and technology aren't necessarily the same thing. And I think the flying cars, the Jetsons version of the future is maybe not where we need to be, and instead think about a future that draws on the stronger elements of the transportation system of the past.
Thank you, Alex. And Thomas, to you.
Thanks, Maribeth. I mean, I echo what Porie and Alex say, and I think I've already made it clear what my personal beliefs are. As individuals, we do have the opportunity to make several decisions every day as to how we move within the city, and I'm sure that all of us in this room have opportunities to be vocal within our communities as to how space is allocated, as to what is a priority. And cities are moving in the right direction. Cities are prioritizing climate action with applying an inclusivity lens, which just resonates so much when you talk about public transport, walking and cycling. So let's be receptive to these changes, because it can really shape a much better future for everyone.
Thank you, Thomas. Well, on behalf of Dominate Impact Investments, thank you each of you for the work you're doing and for joining this conversation. We're pleased to have been able to bring together thought leaders and people really at the forefront of driving a sustainable transportation evolution. As a mutual fund, we'll use our voice and leverage to try to advance this conversation as well. But really, thank you to all who are in attendance and to our speakers. We look forward to continuing in this important work together. And thank you each for joining us.
Thank you,
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
For the rest of your
Thank you,
day.
Thomas, Alex.
Likewise.
Privileged to be
Bye-bye.
Thank you.